All right, hi everyone. Welcome. I think we'll try and get started. You all look like you're diligently eating, which was the purpose of providing food. So don't be shy about that. It's important that we sustain ourselves and each other in this work. And then when we feed people, they tend to stay awake through the talk. They said they're more engaged and present, and it's not only the generosity that we try and cultivate, but it's a good strategy for engagement as well. So I have a number of introductions to make. Just to begin with, my name is Michael Mark Cohen. I'm a professor in American Studies and African American Studies. I'm the director of the Band Scholars Project here in the African American Studies Department. And I just want to welcome you all, and we'll do several sorts of rounds of introductions here in particular. But to begin with, we and particularly in African American Studies, have a distinctive land acknowledgement that we would like to offer, which is to say that we're joining you today from the campus of UC Berkeley, sited on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that every member of this Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We acknowledge and pay respect to the Muwekma Ohlone ancestors, people today, and the Muwekma Ohlone future to come. One way to make concrete such acknowledgements is through the payment of Shumi land tax, a material way for non-Indigenous people living in the East Bay to participate in the rematriation of land to Indigenous peoples. With this in mind, the Department of African American Studies began a practice of giving Shumi quarterly to the Indigenous women-led Sogorete Land Trust, an urban land trust founded in 2012 with the goals of returning traditionally Chochenyo and Karkan lands in the San Francisco Bay Area to Indigenous stewardship and cultivating more active reciprocal relationships with the land. You can find more information on the Shumi land tax at sogoretelandtrust.org. So thank you. Quick thank yous to begin with, first of all, to Gio, who I will introduce shortly for being our second band scholar. We'd like to thank the Social Science Matrix and Eva Cito in particular for hosting us and letting us eat inside their fabulously appointed accommodations. We want to thank the Department of African American Studies, helmed by our chair and leader, Professor Eula Taylor, with the incredible staff support of Sandy Richmond, Lindsay Villarreal, and Maria Herrera. We need to thank the indomitable, incorrigible organizing talents of Barbara Montano, without whom none of this would actually be happening. And we would like to thank the deep pockets of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and Spencer Foundations for their financial support. We do have another event that is happening tomorrow that is not on campus quite deliberately. And this is a movement roundtable that Gio and the Band Scholars Project have organized on abolition, decolonization, and education. This will be happening at the Eastside Arts Alliance, which is at 2277 International Boulevard in Oakland, and will feature Gio, Mohammed Trek, Harsha Walia, and Morningstar Ghali in a conversation about social movements and the a collection, a gathering of Bay Area social movements for purposes of organizing and thinking beyond the bounds of the university. So just to introduce what the Band Scholars Project is, because we're still relatively new here. The Band Scholars Project was an idea generated in the African American Studies Department between myself and my colleagues, particularly Eula Taylor, Professor Nikki Jones, and Professor Tiana Pichel. Funded by a generous grant from the Mellon Foundation, Spencer Foundation, the Band Scholars Project was inspired by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' claim in a speech announcing the banning of DEI programs and ethnic studies teaching in Florida higher education, that students interested in critical race theory or gender studies should, in his words, quote, go to Berkeley. While we appreciate the governor's endorsement of our campus and its ongoing influence in these fields, and Berkeley's legacy as a bastion of free speech rights, often in spite of itself, it clearly comes as an open threat to the teaching of race and gender in public higher education nationwide. After all, Ron DeSantis is not the first politician to attempt to follow in Ronald Reagan's footsteps of riding a hatred of all things Berkeley into higher office. And while Ron DeSantis failed in his attempt to turn his war on woke into a serious presidential bid, the ban to drive these essential fields continues to spread across the nation into Texas, Utah, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, and elsewhere. And now similar plans and threats have been included in the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, which seeks to elevate these state bans into federal policy in a second Trump administration. In the face of this obvious existential threat, not just to our specific fields, but to the entire project of academic freedom and free speech at the public university, our campus leadership has remained inexplicably silent. And I would sort of always add that Ron DeSantis's comment was the greatest missed fundraising opportunity in the campus's recent history. And not only did they just leave millions of dollars on the table from liberals who would have thrown it at us just to piss off Ron DeSantis, but they said nothing to defend the institution in any way, shape, or form, which is really just embarrassing. Indeed, if our campus leadership cannot show a fundamental commitment to defending the public purpose and public good of the public university, which they simply cannot, then it must come from us. After all, it is we, principally the inhabitants of the 5th and 6th floor of this building, who do the research, teaching, and mentorship in these dangerous and now potentially criminalized fields. We are the ones who are under explicit attack, and we believe, as this grant affirms, that to be part of the public university must be to defend the public university, and that it is our common responsibility to advocate for our students, to defend the diversity of our faculty and staff, and to stand for the greater civic good embodied by African American studies and public higher education in general. The Banned Scholars Project is an attempt to push back against these divisive, racist, sexist, homophobic, and transphobic state policies with the strongest weapon available to us: solidarity. And so we are committed to inviting scholars from around the country who are facing the threat directly in their classrooms, with their students, and in their daily experience as activists and educators. You can learn more about the Banned Scholars Project by visiting our departmental website, and pay attention as we continue to escalate our activities into the future. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Gio Maher to be our second banned scholar and to hear his talk on reading Black Reconstruction today. Originally from rural Maine, Gio is no stranger to the East Bay and to this building in particular, where he earned a PhD in political theory in 2010. In his time here, Gio was not only a highly successful graduate student, part of a really remarkable cohort of grad students in that first decade of the 21st century, a hugely successful graduate student, but a critical presence in the social movements that shaped the Bay in this century, including the Oscar Grant uprising, the wave of anti-austerity protests on campus in 2009, and the Occupy movements. Most significantly, during his grad student era, Gio took a prolonged sabbatical to become what I think of as the John Reed of the Bolivarian Revolution, producing two remarkable books on Hugo Chavez and radical democracy in Venezuela. These works include We Created Chavez, A People's History of the Venezuelan Revolt, published by Duke in 2013, and Building the Commune, Radical Democracy in Venezuela, published by Verso in 2016. After graduating from Berkeley, Gio was hired by Drexel University, where he earned tenure in the Departments of Politics and Global Studies in 2016. There he published his major work in political theory, and I have props. I don't have the Venezuelan books, which is embarrassing, I'm confessing unto you, but I do have all of the others. So in particular, his major work in political theory, Decolonizing Dialectics, taking up what he calls a counter-discourse to Hegelian dialectics through the work of George Sorel, Frantz Fanon, Enrique Dussel, and others in an effort to radicalize the dialectical tradition towards a politics of rupture and decolonization. And this is when things begin to get a bit weird for Gio. Always a fiery voice on Twitter, shortly before Christmas 2016, a viral tweet by Gio mocking the imaginary fascist concept of white genocide put him at the center of a national controversy around the free speech of professors, their rights to use social media apart from their academic affiliations, and the obligations of universities to defend their faculty from outside pressures. Refusing to back down or go silent in the face of doxing, online threats, and persistent harassment, Gio fought back, writing, and I quote, "White supremacy is on the rise, and we must fight it by any means. In that fight, universities will need to choose whether they are on the side of free expression and academic debate or on the side of the racist mob." Unfortunately for all of us, Drexler chose to cower to the mob, first condemning, then suspending, before eventually accepting his resignation, thereby truly earning Gio his place as one of our effective banned scholars. Since then, of course, Gio continues to fight back and has published 3 more books, including A World Without Police, How Strong Communities Make Cops Obsolete, published by Verso in 2021. Anticolonial Eruptions, Racial Hubris and the Cunning of Resistance, really a slim but genuinely outstanding book published by UC Press as part of their American Studies Now series, and I have to shout out my own sort of discipline in that regard, and a forthcoming book from Common Notions called Spirals of Revolt, Study and Struggle to Abolish the Present. He has held a long line of teaching positions since then. He's published his writing, journalistic and scholarly writings have appeared all over the place, from South Atlantic Quarterly, Diacritics, Theory and Event, Historical Materialism, Monthly Review, The Nation, The Washington Post, Salon, and Jacobin, just to sort of stick to the more lefty side of that, apart from the Washington Post, obviously. He is the editor of the Radical Americans series at Duke University Press and is an active translator of Latin American political and critical theory into English. Now working largely beyond the bounds of the modern university, Gio's built a presence not only as a major political thinker, but as an innovator and organizer of popular education in Philadelphia, where he is currently the coordinator of the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction. Today, his talk brings these two arenas into dialogue, addressing Du Bois's greatest work, or at least what I believe is his greatest work, seen more props on the desk here, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, first published in 1935, both as a work of political theory essential for addressing the present crisis of racial capitalism, and as the primary object of the Du Bois School's forthcoming term of reading and popular revolutionary education. So please join me in welcoming back to UC Berkeley, Gio Maher.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Michael and Barbara for playing such a huge role and doing so much work in terms of making this this event happen. Thanks to the entire Department of African American Studies for, and I've been talking about this for the past few days, for, you know, when I was a student on the 7th floor, I was always trying to escape, right? And always looking for better places to be, more fruitful and productive places to think. And I found those places, among others, on the 5th and 6th floor. So incredibly thankful for, you know, for these spaces, and really, you know, happy to see that these are continuing to be spaces of radical and critical engagement, and of teaching students the things that students need to be learning. So thank you for having me. I'm really incredibly flattered and super excited to be here. Again, please consider coming out to the evening event. Yes, is this working? Please consider coming out to the event tomorrow night at Eastside. It's going to be a really great conversation, and we hope to build on, you know, some of the things that we'll be talking about here, and expand those into Oakland tomorrow. But today, of course, we're here to speak about Black Reconstruction, an essential text in what it is that we do. That's fine. I can just speak louder. And I want to begin by asking, in some ways, when is a book more than a book? When is it a lens? When is it a prism for seeing or for refracting differently? When is it a portal to an alternative past, present, or future? When is a book not a book at all, but a door? And when is it a key that unlocks that door? A concept is a brick, so wrote Gilles Deleuze in 1,000 Plateaus. It can be used to build a courthouse of reason, or it can be thrown through the window. What to make then of this sort of veritable brick of a book? Is Black Reconstruction for reading, or is it for throwing? We could ask also here, kind of moving alongside Deleuze, what is Black Reconstruction's relation to reason? A question that Du Bois himself raises in his diagnosis and his dismantling of the brutal unreason of the present, what he calls the propaganda of history. We could, and in this ostensibly post-truth age, we must wonder, I think, whether Du Bois's stated goal, which he puts as, and this is in the last chapter, so very interesting chapter. When we read this book collectively, we begin with the last chapter because it really frames out what the rest of the book is doing. But as he puts it in this last chapter, he says his goal is simply, quote, simply to establish the truth on which right in the future may be built. And I think I have a little skepticism here. We say, is this claim, is this goal plausible? Does his tactical distinction between reason and science on the one hand and propaganda on the other hold up? And does he himself fit neatly into the categories that he lays out in this chapter, namely historian, propagandist, philosopher, and prophet? Of course, moving beyond Deleuze, we could also think of Black Reconstruction's relation not only to the courthouse of reason, but instead to the very real courthouses that Du Bois had identified in the souls of Black folk as what he termed the universal device for the re-enslaving of Blacks. Courts not of reason, but courts of color, which in his words, settled a man's conviction on almost any charge. So we can note this kind of complex bifurcation between courts and reason, which then might militate against the smooth refusal of both by a sort of post-structuralist thinker like Deleuze. But some stones, as it turns out, are not for throwing at all. And as I sifted through the many metaphors that might productively be used to describe and help us understand Black Reconstruction, there was one that I could never fully shake and that I kept sort of coming back to, which was that of the Rosetta Stone. A massive stela or slab, the Rosetta Stone was inscribed on its different faces with the same royal decree in multiple different languages. As a metaphor then, the Rosetta Stone underlines, of course, the importance of translating words, aligning meanings across time and space, and the radically expansive and even universalizing implications of doing so. But here, and as Michael mentioned, speaking as a translator, we know that to decipher and to align signifiers, signifieds, and reference in this way is never simply translation. It's never a pure or precise rendering. And here it's worth noting that the original Rosetta Stone did not contain precise translations of the text in question. And this all helps us to think about the ways in which language bears content, it bears context, and how recontextualizing language sheds new and transformative insight. As Fanon quite famously writes, to speak means bearing the weight of a civilization. And he says that with a great deal of ambivalence. So translation is not simply for decoding, but for viewing differently through a sort of productive parallax that can be jarring and destabilizing. It's for shaking common sense through contact with the unfamiliar and with the uncanny. Moving between languages is a giving but also a receiving, and the two are never identical, the ineliminable gap being the key. Translating is a form of travel, and travel, as we know, sets many of our best thinkers into motion, not least Du Bois himself. Written in the registers of history, philosophy, prophecy, and yes, propaganda, Black Reconstruction is all of this and more. Looked at from different angles and toward different ends, it provides us with new and powerful insights for deciphering reality, and specifically the reality of our collective present. What is the nature of this present? We could talk about this for hours, if not days. For many, Donald Trump's 4 years in office seemed an eternity, spiraling forth like a tense double helix of white supremacy and its opposite. The heated crucible of the Trump quadrennium rekindled sharp debates about the fraught tangle of race, class, and gender as scholars and organizers sought to grapple with resurgent white supremacy inside and outside government. Movements for social equality and Black liberation that had erupted spectacularly under Barack Obama, which I always emphasize begins here, begins in Fruitvale, begins in Oakland, California, before spreading nationwide. These same movements came up hard against the resentful politics of white victimhood under Trump, before then exploding from pandemic lockdown into the streets in 2020 in ways that have shaken our political foundations still further, leaving many stumbling in search of new political coordinates. And if there's a single byword around which these movements have coalesced, it's abolition. But as abolitionist scholar activists like Angela Davis, Mariam Kaba, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore insist today, Abolition, past and present, is about far more than simply tearing down repressive institutions. Instead, and despite the name, actively against the name, right, we're talking about a creative and prefigurative process of imagining and building the new kind of world which would render carceral and punitive systems obsolete. Abolition, in other words, is always simultaneously about reconstruction, and we'll come back to this. A fundamentally transformative project in which reparation is not reduced to financial exchange, but instead designates a broader process of repair, so reparation as repair. The insistence on this twin process of abolition and reconstruction, demolition and repair is nothing new, but of course harks back to the abolition of slavery and the destruction by white supremacist terror of the ambitious attempt to build a society of equals after the war. Our moment needs urgent decoding, deciphering, and we have no Rosetta Stone, I believe, more suited to the task than Black Reconstruction. If there's a single book that can help us regain our collective footing and chart a path forward, I believe that this is it. Now, that may seem strange because on the surface of things, this is a straightforward, if ambitious, historical account of the Civil War and its repercussions, which sought to correct this propaganda of history that we began with. But Du Bois does much more than that, as many of you, I'm sure, know. And it's precisely in the way that he tells this particular story that he offers such a potent reconfiguration of US history that unfolds toward an expansive revisioning of past, present, and future. From race and class to the birth of policing, Jim Crow, and global imperialism, from the ashes of Reconstruction, Du Bois paradoxically points us toward the future by training our eyes on the past. Now, I personally have never seen Black Reconstruction as anything but a guide to the present. I first encountered Du Bois's masterwork, not in the academy, but in an intensive study group for movement organizers. And here there's a long and maybe boring sort of prehistory from the sort of Communist Party's failures and withdrawal from Black struggle to the what could be understood as the anti-revisionist breaks that tried to uphold in sectors of the left the historic struggle for Black liberation within the US. My own organization received via that history, and in the figure of someone that that people may be familiar with, Noel Ignatieff, a great thinker who passed a few years ago, who wrote How the Irish Became White. Noel Ignatieff had brought with him the centrality of Black Reconstruction, and that in an organization known as the Sojourner Truth organization was turned into part of a study plan that we then inherited, and that's the way that I was exposed to Black Reconstruction, right? As a key text in thinking through the contradictions of US history. And as we've already kind of, I think, mentioned, this study of Black Reconstruction that I was sort of engaging with for the first time coincided with resonance and found concrete confirmation and affirmation in the streets of Oakland when in January 2009, the city rose up against the police murder of Oscar Grant. And so as a result, I've never even been tempted to see this as a dusty historical text, but instead as a handbook for guiding thinking and guiding action in the present. And the relevance of it has unfortunately, tragically, only become sort of more powerful over the years. This is true of a lot of books, right? If you look at Césaire, if you look at Fanon, if you look at Du Bois, I don't think any of them would want their books and their work to continue to be relevant, and yet here they are as incredibly important guides for the present. Reading Black Reconstruction and reading it today and for today means and opens up different lines of sight. At each turn of this sort of Rosetta Stone, this deciphering device, it reveals more and different lessons depending on how we approach it and what it is that we're looking for. Now, there are many different ways to turn this particular stone, this brick of a book, but here are just a few. And I'm constantly kind of like rearranging the pieces and how I see these and the degree to which I separate them. You could find 12 or 13 or 20 lessons in conceptual terms in this book, but here I've tried to kind of compress them into five main pieces. The first is Marxism and racial capitalism. And people may know, people are familiar with the very increasingly important tradition of racial capitalism probably know that it finds as one of its foundational texts, Black Reconstruction. We find this running through thinkers from Cedric Robinson onto his students, who are many of the people that we know and we refer to today if we're talking about Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Robin Kelly, and many others. So from the very first pages of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois is already engaged in a process of transforming Marxist categories while deploying them. He uses concepts like the black worker to describe enslaved people, and the general strike to explain the effectiveness of their action in ways that cut against the predominant politics of Marxist organizations at the time that he's writing for the most part. So he's reconfiguring, resignifying these words by using them differently, right? To say in the first chapter of The Black Worker is to say a great deal, right? Just to name it that is already to make a huge intervention. And once we kind of zoom out from this resignification, we can see the ways in which this refiguration of Marxist categories speaks to something far larger that we call and refer to maybe as racial capitalist theory. In other words, the centrality of slavery and white supremacy within a broader capitalist system and as an essential structure for underwriting primitive accumulation, for determining susceptibility to hyper-exploitation, and on a political and more practical level to dividing and weakening political struggles. While centering race in capitalism is increasingly common today, less noted is the way that doing so really has an effect of short-circuiting some of Marxism's teleological, linear, and universalist historical assumptions, and introduces a kind of conceptual and historical chaos into those categories and historical vision. And here we find Du Bois resonating very powerfully with his contemporaries like C.L.R. James or Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru. We also see him prefiguring later Third World Marxist thinkers like Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney in their analyses of particularity and unevenness on a global level. Now, internally, this has crucial implications for practices of both repression and of resistance, and corresponds to the question of decoding race and class in US history, including, very notably, and we can talk more about this, recent debates around race and class under Trump, how they fit together, and the kind of, what we could understand is a wooden understanding of how the two pieces are understood in separation from each other versus a kind of not dynamic vision. Because what Du Bois really offers is this kind of dynamic understanding and view of both how race is deployed to discipline and divide workers, and of what the project for building a kind of class unity might look like in the future. Now, while the negative implications of this fraught question are clear in the tragic story of the white workers' betrayal in Black Reconstruction, a betrayal not only of their potential comrades, the black workers and other workers, but also a betrayal of their own interests, right? This is what's fundamental about the stories that white workers, white poor people betray their own interests, and Du Bois sees that as a tragedy. But he also underlines what we could see as the positive side of this centering of slavery within capitalism, and this takes the form, of course, of the agency and the autonomous transformative capacity of enslaved people, and by extension of many other oppressed people in struggle. In other words, centering slavery within capitalism also centers the enslaved in their world-moving and world-making power, their ability to change outcomes, but also to change meanings, right? This is one of the main things about the book, is that not only do formerly enslaved people determine the outcome of the Civil War, but they transform its meaning from a war that was not fundamentally about abolishing slavery into one that had to be and could only be, right? So this is a transformation of meaning and not only outcomes. And in short, the central role of what we could call Black self-activity in history. Now, this was particular to a material arrangement of production at a specific moment, and we can talk about what has changed since over the past century. But it's also a methodological lesson for us in how to track the often unforeseen power of and impact of struggles from below. This is something I talk more about in anti-colonial eruptions. The eruption in the volcano as a sort of confession that one could not see these radical explosions coming because you had blinded yourself to the power of these sectors that you had invisibilized. Again, in this Black self-activity, but also crucially in its downfall a decade later with the defeat of Reconstruction by white terrorism, Du Bois illuminates the crucial question, and this is a sort of a long-standing historical question of the role of force in history. and the limitations in particular of political suffrage absent that force necessary to uphold it, right? Again, broad parameters of the story are that formerly enslaved people have the right to vote, and that as Reconstruction comes toward its end, that right becomes close to meaningless because of the force brought to bear by white terrorism and intimidation and violence, right? Here again, we can think back to long-standing Marxist debates on the role of force, which sought to correct with an economic reading of material conditions, but which effectively bent the stick too far. And so you have a long tradition of third world revolutionaries, Du Bois, but also Fanon, Césaire, and others trying to correct this overstatement whereby force is not the driver of human history, but economic developments and sort of the material conditions are. In this context, the stakes are very clear. Reconstruction was made possible by and only by a dictatorship, and more than a century of liberal scholarship has utterly failed to register the implications of this fact, right? One which raises important challenges to how we understand the world, but also which demands an understanding of different forms of force. Recall that Du Bois himself was tempted to call his chapter on South Carolina, central chapter of the book. He was tempted to call that chapter, he puts in a footnote right on the first page, the dictatorship of the Black proletariat. And he was both tempted and then sort of changed the title at the last minute with good reason, because the history he was telling posed all of the key questions of that conception of dictatorship in terms of the temporality of the transition to socialism, the fact that it takes time and education to begin to prepare a society for equality, and the need for Black self-defense as an alternative to the Union troops, the idea that there are different kinds of dictatorships that could be brought to bear to make that possible. All of which evokes Marx's own insistence, which again, a stubbornly kind of abstract and suicidal liberalism insists on forgetting that material force defeats material force. And as a sidebar here, all of these first three pieces in particular, we find absolutely stunning parallels between Black Reconstruction and Black Jacobins. So for people that don't read Black Jacobins, it's an incredible parallel to this text, written almost exactly at the same time. Neither one knew that the other was writing the book, and yet they were performing and laying out many of the same revolutionary dynamics in them and at the same time. Incidentally, CLR James later says that he thinks Du Bois got it better than him, and for reasons that we can kind of talk about, but they're both such incredible parallel accounts. Fourth, global racial fascism versus the dark proletariat. This is, I think, the most overlooked piece of the, not only Du Bois' account, but of the history of the US Civil War and its aftermath. And this is that it's geared not only toward the US, and it's very much geared toward the global level, right? It doesn't constitute the bulk of the history in the text, and so it's easy to miss. But when you see the framings and the way he describes these dynamics, he is thinking about the global level. And it's in part because this spatial shift in his thinking, or not even a shift, this spatial awareness in his thinking of global and international scale is in some ways the product of the sort of temporal straddling that he's doing, right? He is writing in 1935 and he's writing about 1860s, 1870s, right? So he's talking about both of those moments, but his own moment, which he's very much concerned with, is a moment not only, it is fundamentally a moment of Jim Crow, institutionalized white supremacy, right? That shapes the material conditions of him even writing this book, and it's a clear intervention into that piece. But it's also a moment for him of US imperial expansion. Not only expansion, but dramatic US imperial violence in the 1920s and 30s. So he's writing this history with his eyes kind of keenly trained on this expansion of US imperial power, which he saw not only as complicit with domestic white power, but in fact underwritten and enabled by it, right? As he puts it, with the defeat of Reconstruction, the US became a reactionary force worldwide. If we accept white supremacy at home, of course we accept white supremacy abroad, right, as part of a global imperial power project. Here, though, there are always two sides, right? Here, as everywhere, there are two sides, reaction and resistance. And so if white supremacy was both domestic and global in this sense, so too, for Du Bois, are abolition and resistance, something that I think sometimes our provincial frames for what abolition means can forget that abolition was always, and even prior to in the US, very much a global struggle. So here is where we can also find this powerful account in which Du Bois emerges as a revolutionary internationalist. it's perhaps best expressed in the sort of famous passage in Black Reconstruction toward the end where he writes, "The rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867 to 1876, land, light, and leading for slaves, black, brown, yellow, and white under a dictatorship of the proletariat." So this piece is Du Bois as revolutionary internationalist, right? And here we get a whole range of potential resonances and implications of reading Black Reconstruction for the present, right? You could take it, and we do often take it as a guide for thinking through contemporary questions. Recently, I wrote a little piece in Spectre Journal, which is just worth checking out. It's called Black Reconstruction in Palestine. And this was prior to the sort of like bizarre sort of like discourse that emerged over the summer about how Black and Palestinian struggles are not just unrelated to each other, but actively undermining one another, right? And this is a repetition of certain opportunistic narratives that appear in important moments, but the reality is that the development of Black and Palestinian solidarity over the course of many, many decades is a crucial historical accomplishment in fact. Robin Kelley writes a great deal about this. And what I did in that piece was, most importantly, to look at Reconstruction's universal project, right? Again, a main piece of what Du Bois is arguing about Reconstruction, particularly in South Carolina, is that this was Black government, Black majority government, passing legislation and trying to build a society of equals for all, right? White people benefited more, poor white people benefited more in South Carolina than many Black residents, right? That's a crucial point of what he's trying to say, and it really allows us and provides us a kind of lens for thinking through, for example, what something like From the River to the Sea means, which is just sort of, systematically and intentionally misunderstood by many who want to paint it as a sort of expulsionist or exterminationist frame, when what we're actually talking about is the dismantling of a specific kind of hierarchical, violent ethno-state to build a society for all. So you can look at that internationalist project and understand and look through the lessons that Reconstruction can provide in that way. Finally, and in light of this rebuilding, we have maybe the most powerful lesson that abolitionists today have already taken and continue to take from reading Du Bois's history of Reconstruction, namely that there can be no true abolition without Reconstruction, right? That tearing down repressive or carceral institutions will inevitably fail without the simultaneous project of world building from below. This is something that I sort of talk more directly about in A World Without Police. The subtitle is How Strong Communities Make Cops Obsolete, right? Because if you build a certain kind of community, this is the kind of community in which police make no sense, right? This is what Angela Davis uses the concept of obsolescence to mean, right? What would it mean to exist in a society, not that every single day demands police, demands prisons, which our society does through its inequalities, its fractures, its fragmentations, but to build a society in which those institutions make no sense. So when we hear, again, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore talk about abolition as presence, not simply absence, right? Or if we read Angela Davis writing about making prisons obsolete, what we're hearing also is the lessons of the past ringing in the ears of the present, in the ways in which slavery was abolished in name, in most cases, not all cases, of course, but capitalism, white supremacy, colonialism, patriarchy persisted as underlying and structuring, determining sort of forces. And this failure to repair the damage wrought by centuries of racial slavery birthed what we could see as a deadly institutional chain that stretches from sharecropping to convict leasing, through the racialization of crime, the world of mass incarceration, and political and police impunity that we inhabit today. And so in light of that, when we hear Robin Kelley say, for example, very recently that that Reconstruction means communism, this is what he means by it. He means the reconceiving and the restructuring and rebuilding of a very different kind of world and different kind of community. And taking abolition as Reconstruction seriously inevitably raises some theoretical questions, concretely the question of the commune understood in historical terms, and the way that that historical question of the commune, which is something that I talk about in Venezuela as a concrete project that has been struggling to be built and survive over the past 25 years, how that relates to what, for example, George Jackson calls the Black commune, right? As a form in which, if you haven't read Orasami Burton's Tip of the Spear, it's absolutely sort of essential reading on that question. All of this makes Black Reconstruction a crucial corrective for a political present which once again sets race and class against one another, which once again seeks to excise Black struggles from broader anti-imperial and anti-colonial circuits of solidarity, and which frames abolition today in terms that are either narrowly focused on the police and prisons or utterly impoverished by liberal commitments and the blind spots they bring. And this is, very much see our political present, for example, in Philadelphia, as shaped by the seismic impact of 2020, which throws thousands of people in the city, hundreds of thousands nationwide, into thinking and talking about abolition, which makes abolition a mainstream frame for thinking about these questions. There was a great organizer in Minneapolis at the time, and she said, in 2017, speaking to a prior wave of resistance, she said, in 2017, we knew what the problem was. In 2020, we knew what the solution was, right? These escalating spirals of consciousness about what this solution looks like, right? So this is a product of 2020. But this massification, right, this this expansion of abolition as a frame also brings with it very real questions, which many of you are probably familiar with, right? What do we mean when we say abolition? What do we mean when we see abolition pulled into the university in certain ways, or we see it described and institutionalized in nonprofits that are not particularly radical or that are trying to empty it of some of its more radical content, right? So how do we navigate that? These are questions that I think Black Reconstruction can help us to think about. Now, I want to just close by briefly foregrounding two projects that are anchored in this understanding and anchored in this reading. The first is a forthcoming volume that I'm co-editing with Yusuf Al-Balushi and Damien Sojourner at UC Irvine, in which will be published ideally by UC Press and will most likely be called exactly what we're talking about today, Reading Black Reconstruction Today. And in it, we're really bringing together an incredible array of leading voices on abolition, decolonization, and revolutionary struggle to talk about some of the importance of this text, to look locally at what it would mean, say, to use Black Reconstruction to think through the Palestinian struggle, or to think through, struggles in Philadelphia. And my chapter in particular is about Black Reconstruction in Latin America. And using the frames of Black Reconstruction, but also the acute awareness that Du Bois himself had of hemispheric struggles, of Latin American struggles. He's very concerned with these questions to think about not only past, but also present and future questions, to think about what Black Reconstruction can offer us for thinking about those struggles. And it's an incredibly interesting question that for Du Bois starts with the question of Haiti. There's this very short letter in his archives that he's sending to a Latin American solidarity organization. And they've asked him in some way to contribute to or to put his name onto a letter, a Latin America solidarity letter. And he just writes a very short letter that says, I've read your journals and I see that you make no mention of Haiti. Is this intentional, right? So this for Du Bois is the starting point, because Haiti is Latin America. The Haitian Revolution is a founding moment, not only in global revolutionary traditions, but the Latin American tradition too. And there's a long here sort of story of the term Latin America, which is broadly misunderstood. It actually comes from and is developed by French, by an attempt by the French to regain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. They're the ones who developed this conception of Latin unity and attempt to sort of incorporate their Catholic sort of like, horizontal power against US kind of imperial power. So that's an incredibly interesting way to think through it. The second project I really want to emphasize is, as Michael mentioned, the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction, where we view Black Reconstruction not only as a Rosetta Stone, but as a cornerstone and as a sort of foothold for concretely moving forward toward that vast project of social reconstruction. We often say there's no abolition without reconstruction. It's part of our sort of like our sort of slogans and catchphrases. And we do essentially on the ground, in-person participatory political education, grounded in, and I brought it here, a 12-week curriculum that we actually just published, this little book. It's cute. It'll be available from Common Notions Press. It's called Abolition and Reconstruction. And it includes not only primary text for each week of study, but also study questions. And in the back, a facilitation guide, which people can use this to deliver and participate in the curriculum elsewhere outside of Philadelphia. And that will be available at cost for study groups. But what we do on the ground is to another phrase that we often use is that we study the world to change it, meaning that we're not just doing organizing trainings or study or sort of delivering skills to organizers, but we begin from the fact that people need to understand that understanding the world is fundamental to beginning to change it. When it comes to abolition, this turns precisely on the question of thinking that we're just up against police and prisons and not understanding the foundational reasons why that may be, right? So we begin with basics of participatory education and the way that we come together and collectively build understanding and build solidarity in the space. It's a practical sort of intersectionality. It's a practical internationalism that we build in the space. We operate according to 4 basic principles: abolitionist, internationalist, intersectional, and participatory. And we build a 12-week understanding of the origins and historical development and emergence of capitalism on a global level, the fact that white supremacy and colonialism are central to that history, which we anchor with the conception of primitive accumulation as an ongoing process of hyper-exploitation. We study Black Reconstruction in the middle, and we understand and think about then returning to questions of policing prison today on a higher level, what it means strategically to understand the centrality of those institutions in upholding these broader systems and the project of Reconstruction. So 2 projects, the book, the school, and if one piece is more intellectual and the other more concrete, I think we know perfectly well that the distance between the 2 should not be overstated. While it's true, as we already mentioned, that material force defeats material force, we can't forget what Marx immediately adds right after that. For some of you may remember, but what he immediately says is theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. From which Marx immediately proceeds in this kind of like conceptual cascade. He says theory grips the masses when it becomes radical. It becomes radical when it gets to the root. And it gets to the root when it realizes that the root is humanity itself. Thank you all.
I'm just here to run the Q&A to the best of our ability. But thank you very much. That was really quite outstanding. I have myriad questions, but one question I guess I would think about the book to begin with, and then we'll turn it over to the room. And I would certainly to the Du Bois in particular. I'm just curious in terms of like your teaching and in terms of your thinking. The Civil War is sort of not necessarily it is in there in your sort of categories. And I'm just wondering like how we think about the actual Du Bois's complete reframing about the Civil War, particularly when we see that the material presence of not just the Civil War, but the legacy, the memory, the historiography of the Civil War. I just keep thinking about the image of the Confederate flag in the Capitol after January 6th and the persistence of that kind of basic struggle and how Du Bois helps us think through like not just the Civil War, but and indeed the people carrying those battle flags fantasizing about the United States being in a condition of a second Civil War, desirous of bringing about a second Civil War, and how we might think about that.
That's super interesting. I think, does this work? I have to duck way down for it. I think it's on again. There's this bizarre desire not only to be in a new Civil War, but to identify with the losing side is just like a deep, deep thing to me. I mean, people know the Alamo. I spent some time in Texas. And so the Alamo is a funny thing where it's like, you got your asses handed to you at the Alamo and all you want to do is keep talking about it, right? As if it's a sort of like, a badge of honor to have lost. And that was, of course, a white supremacist, expansionist land grab that was sort of crowned and capped off in that moment. I think these things are very similar. I think they're deeply rooted in the structure of contemporary sort of white supremacist victim narratives, right? Where you look at, and this goes, I think, everything from the Great Replacement theories to the sort of Walmart shooter in South Texas. It's like the narrative is we are being invaded, not that we have done the invading, which is actually the reality. Right, and so this inversion, I think, that happens, that plays a big role in that. And I don't know that I really have a good understanding of the why of that, aside from the fact that it's, on the one hand, a central reference point for the South in particular, but it goes far beyond the South. Right, Confederate identity is this sort of cancerous growth, that happens, and you see this very much with, other, folks who identify with foreign, white supremacist struggles as well, and incorporate them into this broader sort of identity. So how does that relate? I mean, and it is interesting because like most of what I talked about was not about what the book actually says, right? And so I hope people who haven't read the book have a basic understanding of the historical structure of what we're talking about, and the way that that then gives rise to these lessons. But the main piece when it comes to the war itself, of course, is that the war is not initially fought to end slavery, certainly. It is a war about slavery for the South, and Du Bois spends a great deal of time emphasizing that fact, right? Because that's denied, of course, today as well, that it's about states' rights, or other things. The Fugitive Slave Act is the best evidence against it being about states' rights because it was about a federal overreach by the South, insisting that all northern states comply. It was about the struggle for political and ultimately economic power across the country, like the questions in the debates on apportionment, right? And how those debates on apportionment relate to the debates around the Reconstruction,
They're all falling.
and these are central to the question. But again, what Du Bois shows is that this war that doesn't start, and this is a fundamental piece, right? The war that doesn't start as a war against slavery becomes a war against slavery, and for very complex and material reasons. But the fundamental one being the intervention that enslaved people and then formerly enslaved people make into that history, right? And it's an interesting intervention because it's a very hesitant intervention. He says, when the war breaks out, most enslaved people wait and watch and listen and hesitate, right? And in that hesitation, I think there's a great deal that can be said. Something very similar happens with Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, for example. And built into that hesitation and into what then becomes the general strike when enslaved people walk off the plantations, 500,000, and doom the war effort, right? They're the ones doing the, providing the food for the soldiers. And they're the sort of built-in advantage of the Southern armies. And so when they walk away, there's either no food or there's no soldiers because white soldiers have to go back and work on the farms. And this is hugely sort of decisive for the question of the war. But there's a built-in piece that's very interesting there about spontaneity, right? He calls it a general strike, and this is again a critical intervention around sort of Marxist categories. He says this is a general strike. Of course, a general strike is when workers in factories walk off the job en masse, and it's highly organized, right? That doesn't happen in industrial society unless it's highly organized, according to sort of most accounts. So what Du Bois is also showing is that a much more spontaneous process that's emerging, as he puts it, only as it could have emerged in these, in this sort of like reality in which there is, on the one hand, very low literacy, very little coordination between, different communities that exist at a distance from each other. This is a huge difference between the U.S. and, say, Caribbean sort of slave systems. People exist at a large distance from each other. So there's a spontaneity where people are walking off all at the same time and toward the same ends in a kind of way without being in concrete, organized communication with each other. But there's also another piece which persistently comes up, and it's something I talk about in the Eruptions book as well, which is this idea of not just an underground railroad, but an underground telegraph. This is a phrase that many sort of slave masters used at the time to explain the inexplicable communication that they couldn't see happening, right? So someone would know something that they had heard from someone 60 or 70 miles away, and no one could figure out exactly how that word was being passed. So like thinking more in more complex ways about how that agency, that self-activity of enslaved people emerges, how it consolidates, the walking off of the plantations as transforming the war effort, driving the realization, and in fact forcing the realization by the North and by someone like Lincoln in particular, that not only do you have to engage in emancipation, right? You have to embrace it, but that you have to eventually, it goes through these stages, right? Accepting the so-called contrabands is a debate. Putting them to work as spies and other, sort of like menial tasks is a debate. And then ultimately making them soldiers is a significant debate. And here we get into this sort of deeply Hegelian territory where Du Bois sees it as very, very tragic. He says, enslaved people begged for freedom, tried to explain their equality, argue for it, plead, and it didn't work. They killed white men, and suddenly they themselves were men, right? And Du Bois says, tragic though it may be, only murder makes men. And so here's something that he's identifying in a very ambivalent way as central to this piece, right? The engaging in the struggle as part of this sort of development of what proved to be kind of a temporary understanding that equality had been accomplished. I'm sort of going off a little bit, so I should.
No, it's great. I love it. I could talk about this book all day. What questions do you all have for us, please? I can just sit up here and read the passages he just cited. Yeah, no, I've got them all. Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much for a really beautiful and thoughtful talk and for all of your work. Gosh, I guess I really loved your reading of how Black Reconstruction can help us think about the Palestinian struggle and kind of think about these ways that the ways that white workers benefit, right? And this is against the whole argument around them systematically not being able to see their own interests, right? And so I think that's really useful. And at the same time, I wonder, like, Black Reconstruction is enough to bite on for your whole, like, kind of career as activist scholars. And at the same time, it's not the only Du Bois that exists. We all know that Du Bois lived a very long life and he wrote a ton. We could all only be so lucky to be as prolific as Du Bois. But in that, there are a lot of contradictions, right? And so I wonder, like, as you're thinking about either the Palestinian struggle or thinking about Du Bois in Latin America, how you contend with the multiple Du Boises that exist. And there's so many things that could be mentioned, but Du Bois, when he writes about Brazil for the first time, he's like, this is a place where the man of color is actually living great and there's no color line. Mm-hmm. Same kind of impulse he has when he goes to LA and sees that Black home ownership rates are high. And he talks about the streets of LA as like this place where the man of color has never been, like, it's orange scented streets and everything is lovely. And then he also has this kind of, nationalist romanticism about the state of Israel and uses very racist language to justify the state of Israel. And so I wonder, like, as we think about the real important gems and the Rosetta Stone, like, kind of aspect of this particular work, how do you reckon with the man, I guess, and how do you reckon with, like, the body of the work as you kind of wield it in these beautiful ways on the ground, but kind of have to contend maybe also with the complexity?
No, it's a wonderful and really essential question. In Black Reconstruction, of course, there are huge blind spots, right? Settler colonialism being a fundamental one, and it's there in very interesting ways that are, again, for him, very ambivalent, right? When he talks about the myth of the American assumption, the myth of this idea that we can all sort of like become, sovereign and, accumulate wealth and gain a certain amount of freedom. And he says that the closest that ever came to reality was because of the frontier, right? The idea that people could expand, could accumulate on the basis of land ownership. And so those things are there, and again, in ways that he's not necessarily saying are wonderful, but he does have this ambivalence and this kind of like very strange, almost nationalism that emerges from the text as well, right? And I think you see this in a lot of thinkers you see it sort of very powerfully in someone like Douglass, right? For whom there are these periods of like, like during Reconstruction, we see the possibility of the US being a very different kind of force in the world. And so as a result, we're going to come very close to saying, like, it might be a good thing for the US to annex parts of Latin America, right? And make them more democratic, right? Like, so there's these very strange things that are coming out of these very different understandings of what the US represents, right? And Du Bois, when it comes to Latin America, I think, as you mentioned on Brazil, something very similar happens with Cuba, right? Where he's very desperately looking for a society in which the color line doesn't weigh so heavily, right? And that leads him to misrepresent those places, right? And I think there's like biographical pieces here, like who his friends were, who he went and talked to in those countries. Particularly in Brazil, it tended to be more sort of white kind of elites who believed in this idea of racial democracy and believed that they were building this different kind of society, which we know not to be true. He does, I think, come around on both of those fronts where he's like, and what's interesting, and I think very interesting about the question, is that he's doing this in many cases after he writes Black Reconstruction, right? And certainly after he knows that the fundamental piece, right, if he's saying like land, light, and leading, right, is land, right? The fundamental piece is this material redistribution question and material rearrangement. And even after that, he's not asking those questions right away around Brazil, right? Of like who actually has economic and material power. And so I think there are a lot of, yeah, contradictions where, and I think just to say that some of that definitely comes from him really being desirous of like finding alternative spaces, right? And I think that happens with a lot of thinkers. But yeah, no, and it becomes very interesting for thinking through these questions. Like I often go back to, our understanding of the emergence of whiteness in the U.S. context as stemming from Bacon's rebellion in the 1670s, right? And the fact that the fear of unified black-white, revolt leads planters to institutionalize on a legal level racialized slavery and white privilege, right, in this sort of simultaneous move. But the unspoken kind of backdrop of that is indigenous dispossession of land, right? This is one of the demands, right? And so one of the projects moving forward has to be thinking through the ways that relations to the land can be rebuilt in different ways. And I often turn to a couple of pieces to think about that. One is Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson have this great book called As Black as Resistance, which deals very directly with the question of the Black Belt, right? This long-standing radical communist demand for Black self-governance in the U.S. South. And they deal critically with the fact that in a certain way that presupposes indigenous dispossession, right? And thinking through what it would mean to kind of turn that inside out and think about rebuilding a different kind of indigeneity and a different kind of relation to that land. And the other one is the Red Nations book, The Red Deal, which is a really programmatic, beautiful case for that, for decolonization of the US and the world, but that for me runs directly in parallel to some of these claims, right? Because the point is, just as Reconstruction was for everyone, the Red Nation is saying, like, we are an indigenous revolutionary collective, but decolonization is for everyone, right? It's for us all to be re-engaged in different ways with indigenous modes of governance that mean we relate to each other differently and we relate to the land differently. So as a project, right, separating the project from the man a little bit and trying to think through what that would look like today.
Du Bois had a similar response to the Soviet Union when he traveled there and said, declared himself a Bolshevik, and he had that moment of arrival, the experience of the alternative, taking it as sort of a surface value and responding with tremendous enthusiasm that he would, over decades, eventually undercut and think more seriously about. But it is kind of fun. Yeah, please, Samana.
Thank you, Gio, for this. I'm going to continue with this question slightly, and I'm going to ask you, whereas we think of whereas in the United States, we can think of abolition and reconstruction together as you propose, as it's been proposed. I wonder whether this translates, not the abolition bit, but the reconstruction bit, whether it translates in any internationalist sense, if one wants to be an internationalist, whether reconstruction translates to places of total destruction, where reconstruction is actually the international agencies, the various, reconstruction is a way of governing. Reconstruction is a way of turning subjects governable. And what is needed from the site of destruction, or the subjects who are about to be destroyed, who have gone through destruction, let's call them the destructible, face a different conundrum. That form of life, that kind of political organization, is not necessarily aimed at reconstruction. It's aiming at something else in the midst of destructibility. And so that's why I'm asking. I'm wondering whether we can step over that step. I mean, it might be reconstruction if we think in stages terms. It might be that is what is to come. But in the moment, can we step over that ongoing destruction and destructibility, the experience of being destructible, to think reconstruction, and is that translatable? Yeah.
I mean, it's a great question, and there's this temptation to say, well, it just means something different, right? Like, it's not the word, but we're actually not talking about the word, it's the thing. Like, what is the thing that we're talking about, right? And I think the question in that way, when you move from the word to the thing, really underlines something that's incredibly important to say about Du Bois's book, which is that despite its sort of groundbreaking interventions into rewriting that history, despite the centering of Black agency, spontaneous struggle, right? Grassroots struggle. Because of the kind of story, it's actually precisely because of the kind of story he's trying to tell that it's very much a history from above, right? It's a history driven from below, but it's a history of and measured from above, right? In other words, what are the state governments doing? What is the federal government doing? How do the two relate to each other? And in that sense, it's not wrong, but it's a very partial story, right? And I think one of the good things is that we begin to see, I mean, it's, again, the same thing happens with Black Jacobins, right? Where it's more of a story from above. And then you have people like Carolyn Fick writing great books about the Haitian Revolutionary Maroon movements that are left out of that story, right? So what happens on the ground, right? And I think something like Tulani Davis's Emancipation Circuit tells us very much the other side of that story. It's an incredible book about what happens when this general strike is undertaken, right? It's not simply like Du Bois's story is they walk off the plantations. Here's what that means for the Southern War effort and for sort of, you know, North-South diplomacy and war making, right? What she asks is what happens in those spaces of kind of community building where a new form of democracy, a new form of community sort of, you know, debate and discussion and political theorizing, as she puts it, is taking place in those encampments, right? So the camp as a location for a new kind of participatory, you know, practice that gives rise to new ideas. And that's why when I'm thinking about Palestine, and I think that's not to say that it's, you know, like that I, you know, show sufficient awareness to the question of devastation, right? But thinking about the ways in which the camp is a location for a new groundedness of struggle, right? How displacement, you know, and I talk about this kind of, you know, metaphor of the River Jordan in sort of Black spiritual thought, right? But also how that manifests, it's a very concrete thing, right? When you're driven past the River Jordan in, you know, like with a gun to your back into, you know, into refugee camps in, you know, in 1948 and 1967. It's a very, very different thing. But trying to hold on to and think about what would fill out that story, I think is important, right? What's the untold underside of that story? The degree to which the absolute, and again, I often run the risk of kind of overstating it, but just the incredible and permanent creativity of those struggles in the most desperate and desolate spaces, right? The creativity, the humanity that's generated, that explodes out of them, I think is so awe-inspiring, historically speaking.
Yeah, please, Michael.
Yeah, this was very interesting. I would like to follow up on this internationalist perspective that Tiana began, and that you responded about the contradictions within Du Bois. I mean, there is a litany of similar problematic claims that you mentioned: Brazil, Cuba, Israel, Palestine, China, Russia, Liberia, to name just a few. They all are of an internationalist character. And yeah, one could argue that, as some have, that he's an elitist, and he's always taking the standpoint of the elite, or that he didn't have the experience of these countries. And I wonder whether there is something else in common, that they all stem from his anti-imperialism, his anti-US statism, that leads him to misunderstand and to perhaps sideline the actual struggles that are taking place in India, in Africa, in Brazil, in Cuba. And the paradox then seems to me is that he never really applies the lessons of Black Reconstruction to his analysis of other countries, because he is so focused on who is anti-state in the world, anti-US state in the world.
I mean, it's a great question because I mean, as you know, we periodically confront moments in which that kind of thinking becomes predominant again, right? And it's always a good thing when anti-imperialism reemerges as a force, and it's always so limited by the fact that it emerges in ways that are incredibly reductive, right? The idea that anti-imperialism is a politics in and of itself, right? We see it around questions. I mean, it's the past sort of 10 or 15 years has been one of these moments, right? We see it around questions of Syria. we see it then sort of unfolding into this question of how to relate to, say, Russia's role in the world, the emerging and clear multipolarity, right? And global multipolarity is a good thing, but it also complicates this understanding that there's one sort of singular global hegemon to be opposed, right? And that opposition, whether it's in Venezuela, for example, or elsewhere, leads to a reduction, right? And so it's always important, I think, to walk a very, like a fine line around those questions. And it's difficult, right? The historical moments that Du Bois was operating in, and we already talked a little bit about like the way that Reconstruction reconfigures many people's feeling about whether the US is a globally good thing, right? And can play a positive role. But then we have something very similar happening around World War II, which is this, in retrospect, slightly bizarre alliance between the US and the Soviet Union, right? This sort of anti-fascist alliance, which completely reconfigures the way that US communists are thinking and talking, right? Like to the point where, what's his name? The head of the US Communist Party dissolves the party because he wants to be part of a sort of like the US democratic system and participate in it and be not opposed to it. And so there are all these reconfigurations that are happening, and and many people are, I think, trying to keep up with what's going on, right? Now, on the question of, again, and we touched on this a bit earlier, the question of who he's speaking to and who his friends are, and then the question of the sort of elitism of the frame, right? And I think Du Bois is someone who is, in some ways, fundamentally elite, but at the same time makes incredible progress throughout his life to, again, foreground, the source of struggle and liberation being, and coming from, working class and poor sectors of society, right? And there are these, I had this conversation with someone once because there's this, people probably remember I just saw this bug right here. Yeah. So this passage that some of you probably know in Black Reconstruction, where he's describing, this is the coming of the Lord piece, where it's like liberation is understood in a sort of radically sort of religious frame, right? It's, a cataclysmic kind of moment. And the first time I read it, I was like, oh, like, he says it was all tawdry and dirty, and, this like picture these sort of poor and filthy people like talking about, the coming of the Lord, right? And I took that to be a sort of like slyly kind of ironic description, and like he's sort of playing with it. And then I started to realize that no, he actually is very elite, right? Like that to him does seem a little kind of tawdry, and he is a very sort of rational person who nevertheless tries to make space for the irrational source of struggle, right? If that makes sense, right? So he's trying to correct on these questions, and doesn't get all the way with many of the pieces. But I do think, I do want to like make sure and emphasize the fact that it's too easy to say, oh, well, Du Bois was wrong about Russia, or Du Bois was wrong about China, because he was, again, he's looking for spaces of sort of multiracial democracy. He was also looking for spaces of liberation and spaces of struggle. And these were spaces that for many years were identified with communism, right? And one of the tragedies of the Soviet project that I think is misunderstood, that I misunderstood for many years, is the fact that that was a project dedicated to Black liberation for many, many years. And that was the primary force driving Black liberation for many years and Black organizing, and then withdrew from that space, right? And then, pulled back from that struggle. And this leaves people like Du Bois and others sort of struggling to find and to locate another place to identify with.
Can I ask? I would love to ask a question, which is framing Black Reconstruction in the way that we have. I think is really quite outstanding. Of course, the most kind of famous phrase to come out of this book, the one that's sort of resonated the widest, is here on page 700. Which he says that it must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. And this concept of the wages of whiteness that gave birth to David Roediger and the whole field of whiteness studies. Is this still an effective and useful way of thinking about whiteness in the United States?
And it's funny, the little sort of like, maybe slightly boring personal history that I was telling comes very much out of that tradition, right? Like Ignatieff and others, they come out of this sort of like these communist organizing groups. Roediger, Ted Allen was part of the POC, the Provisional Organizing Committee that leaves the Communist Party, leaves it precisely because they want to continue to struggle for Black liberation, right? The point is that the Communist Party is abandoning that struggle. They're trying to figure out a new way forward. They're reading Black Reconstruction and making it part of their understanding. Roediger and others are making this into and developing a theory of white skin privilege theory, wages of whiteness theory. I think is incredibly useful, right? And I think, some things that need to be understood about it are that because it gets right to this question of because in some ways it's too simplistic to say that white workers or white poor people betrayed their own interests, right? It's more complicated than that, right? Because on the one hand, and he says, the first piece is that the wages of whiteness are not just psychological, but they're also material, right? And we know that, and we know that today, right? And back then what it meant was, not only is it the case that you feel better than someone, which is a powerful wage, right? Like incredibly important to many people, right? People today who are voting for the fascist right while their communities are sort of dying of opioid overdoses and poverty, right? Like it's wild, right? We know how powerful that is. But there's a material piece also, which is that there are jobs connected to that. There are privileges connected to that are material, right? And that's important to understand. And ultimately, the political piece, the political sort of argument has to be something more complicated than that, right? Which is that you are sacrificing some petty privileges for, on the one hand, a very different way of living that we think is better, right? And looks better in a different kind of society in which we can live in equality. And that does mean, I think we know concretely from the experience of Reconstruction, that for many white people, there are also material benefits to be had, right? But that the benefits are also fundamentally about understanding the world in a different way, right? Living in a kind of equality. And again, I think about that a lot when it comes to Palestine, right? Because I think about the liberation that the really indescribably powerful liberation that the dismantling of Israel would mean for many Jews who are bound to identify with this violent state and its actions, right, as part of their identity, right? And I think, of course, there's a massive, and longstanding Jewish tradition that refuses to identify with it because of this embrace of a different kind of, sort of psychological understanding of what the world should look like. I think on a political level, and again, this is maybe potentially boring, but as I was in an organization that very much was grounded in this question of thinking through what the wages of whiteness look like and how to engage with it and how to organize against it politically. And one of the outgrowths of it was that there was a way in which, and this is important to understand, that what was referred to as like white skin privilege theory or white then became kind of whiteness studies, like when there's a not insignificant connection between these sort of very radical thinkers like Ignatieff and Rosetta and others who are doing very real political organizing and like a Tim Wise, right? Which is in the sense that like you're ultimately still centering whiteness as the category, right? And I think part of what Du Bois does that's so much more powerful than that is to say that this is an important implication of this struggle and outgrowth of the failures of this struggle, but that the driving force is elsewhere. Right? And I say that all, and maybe it's a little obvious, but I say because like that comes up in organizing circles that I've been in, where like we were in an organization and we were organizing around, Ignatieff and others were then part of a journal called Race Trader, right? It says that, and the slogan was treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. Incredibly powerful slogan, incredibly important for me. But the idea of race treason as an organizing principle assumes that you're organizing white people, right? And I think it's a partial and important but very limited frame that then needs to give way to a different understanding of what revolutionary multiracial organizing looks like and what frames it needs.
That's great. Thank you. I loved Race Trader. That was a great journal. Can we, Dr. Jones, you want to offer the last question?
The last question. Yeah, I want to hear more about Philadelphia and the people of Philadelphia. I want to know the people who are in the room and the battles, And so I spent time in Philadelphia, did some research, did work in Philadelphia. Philadelphia Negro, deeply influential in trying to make sense of Philadelphia, and some of that helps to make sense of Philadelphia today. If you think about the policing and who's in the prisons and who's on probation and who's on parole, and also thinking about the expansion of both the private and public university into neighborhoods in Philadelphia that have displaced people. And so haven't been there for 20 years, and so I imagine there's been some change, but I really want to know where are people, where are the front lines, where are the battles, what are people, doing with the wisdom, knowledge that they're gaining in the school?
That's a great question. And I mean, as you know very well, but I mean, maybe others don't, the history of Philadelphia is super interesting. We have a week in our curriculum on Philadelphia, and we were looking at all these different texts, and we ended up using, a piece from Mumia that really, it just covers the whole arc of Philadelphia history in such a comprehensive way. But a huge amount of that arc is that this is a southern northern city, right? It's a border city in that sense. It's the location of a huge amount of Underground Railroad activity because it's a sort of a point of arrival. But the history of that, the political power structure of that city is a history of the incorporation of white ethnics into that power structure, right? In other words, you have like waspy whites in power, and then you have waves of migration from Ireland and from Italy, and you have struggles for incorporation by them, right? Irish and Italian communities become the basis for the sort of gangs, the neighborhood gangs that become firefighters, that become police. And Irish are incorporated first. There's this very interesting story where Frank Rizzo, which people may know, is the sort of clearest expression of white supremacy in recent Philadelphia history, and this is very late, right? 70s into the 80s. This is someone who brutalized and humiliated and took pleasure in racist humiliation of the Black Panthers, but of Black Philadelphians in general as the police commissioner, and is then elected mayor, right? On explicitly white supremacist grounds. But there's a really, interesting piece, and this is, if people haven't read the book Up South, right? It's a great and crucial book about Philadelphia. But Rizzo hated the Irish more than he hated Black people. And it's because they were the people who had acquired access to the political power structure, right? So you've got this creation of a white coalition, not a white coalition. It's not even a coalition, right? This is the incorporation of whiteness, right? And this is the very real piece that Ignatieff underlines, is that Italian and Irish people were not really white at certain points, and then they gain access to it, but you gain access to whiteness, which is a political category, only by policing and overseeing Black and other sort of like communities of color, right? So this is the history of Philadelphia, right? On the one side, and the other side is this long history of Black and abolitionist struggle, which is very complicated because as Du Bois mentions, there were Black police in Philadelphia in the 1890s, which is wild to imagine, especially, when you think of the long arc of that sort of like racist sort of incorporation. But then the history kind of reconnects in the 80s when it's a Black mayor who oversees the bombing of the MOVE organization, right? And when you realize the ways in which the political power structure for a long time upheld, these sort of principles of white supremacy without the explicitly white supremacist leadership. I got to Philly like 15 years ago, and I think since then it was just a very dramatic turning point. I think there were there's lots of longstanding organizing there, lots of abolitionist organizing. It's the home of sort of Mumia and campaigns around Mumia, but also Russell Maroon Schultz and many others. And a lot of abolitionist organizing around political prisoners was taking place there, but particularly especially since 2014, 2015, you saw just a dramatic explosion of what was possible in terms of these kinds of struggles against the police. Movements have been very much on the offensive in ways that have created ever greater spaces. So you see something like, for example, the election of Larry Krasner as district attorney. I mean, it was a huge victory. It's not a sort of like 100% victory. It's a very contradictory thing to have a progressive or radical district attorney, and he has shown his own limitations, but that was the product of that movement power, right? Those are the people that put him there, and he's someone who defended our organizers, from jail before. 2020 was massively important, right? It really reset a lot of just the positions and the possibilities of struggle, and has dramatically shifted that. And things look, you have to it's always this task of looking beyond the surface and seeing where the sort of underlying structures are at. Because on the surface, we have a kind of Eric Adams style mayor in Sherelle Parker. She's pushing incredibly reactionary policies, stop and frisk, increased policing, sweeping of Kensington, of sort of drug users and criminalization of drug use. But I think that's more on the surface. I think below the surface, the power is very much potentially in the hands of organizers and movement leaders. And we've seen that in the incredibly effective Palestine organizing over the past year. So we launched the school just over a year ago. immediately October 7th happened, but also, there were like police killings that people were organizing around. And our students were studying and then also doing that work and being on the front lines of that work and using, for example, categories that we were learning and analyzing to think through and to sort of deepen that work. And now we've got a community of almost 200 people who have studied in our basic sort of seminar. It's a 12-week seminar, intensive collective study. And again, part of what we do is we study these things, but we also build solidarity in the room, right? So people were coming to these struggles, coming to study from different struggles, right? There's an ongoing campaign against the new 76ers arena that's displacing Chinatown, or is threatening to displace Chinatown. There was a now concluded struggle against the displacement of the University City townhomes by UPenn, which was, these townhomes were the product of, which you are probably more maybe familiar with, the displacement of the Black Bottoms during the struggle around the Science Center. So these people were displaced to 40th Street, then displaced again. And what we had were a lot of struggles against displacement in the city, right? And so bringing people together from very different communities, sort of Spanish-speaking communities and Chinatown communities and sort of Black West Philadelphians to study primitive accumulation and displacement and gentrification together is really powerful, right? So people see their struggles in other struggles. And so it's been incredibly effective, I think, in that way. We've had some setbacks. People that pay attention to it probably know that we had, one of our educators was sent to federal prison as a result of 2020 organizing. And it was an explicitly political sentence, but luckily he's back with us. He is sort of like, not too much worse for the wear, and re-engaged in our education right now. So please check out is it still up there? Oh yeah, the QR code. You can learn a little more about what we do. Check it out. Common Notions will have the reader. And yeah, we'll be talking about that more tomorrow night as well.
Thank you. That was a terrific question to end on. Please join me in thanking Maher for a terrific talk. Thank you. All right. Hopefully we'll see you tomorrow night at the Eastside Arts Alliance. This starts at 6 o'clock. Yes, and thank you. Have a great day.